Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
Good afternoon. Welcome to the Visiting Speaker Series. I'm so glad you could all join us on this beautiful afternoon. Our guest today is Bob Seidensticker, who I've known for many years now, and I've been waiting very patiently and very excitedly for his new book, Future Hype, to come out. He has written books in the past and has worked in the technology industry for over 25 years, and just has some very, very interesting and provocative thinking about how much technology truly changes us as humans and changes our culture. So I'm very excited that he could take the time to come chat with us this afternoon. Please help me welcome Bob Seidensticker.
Thank you. Well, thank you for all coming out. I'd like to hope this is interesting for you as much as it is for me. I'd like to begin by suggesting this challenge. Abandon all technology and live in the woods for a week and see if it's your laptop you miss the most. And I think that any of us faced with this challenge, and of course I'm talking about all technology. This is not just the internet and cell phones. I'm talking about housing, clean water, convenient access to food, textiles. We would have a very different appreciation, a more fundamental appreciation for the technologies on which society really is built. So how does technology change work, and how does that affect us? We can't see technology correctly unless we can't deal with technology unless we see it correctly. We can't understand it, we can't anticipate it, we can't control it. We've been misled, we've been deceived about technology change, and that's what I'd like to talk to you about today. I'd like to talk about 3 technology myths, explore those, move on to the hidden cost, the cost behind buying into these myths, being duped by these, and finally wrap up with some suggestions for how to be smarter technology consumers. So myth number 1 is the idea that technology is exponential. It's increasing exponentially. I'd like to illustrate this with a couple of quotes. This is from Future Shock, 1970, a blockbuster book. The quote is, "I was born in the middle of human history. Almost as much has happened since I was born as happened before." And here's a more modern version. This is from Ray Kurzweil. "We're doubling the rate of technical progress every decade." So I love the fact that he's being very quantitative about this, not wishy-washy. Now, of course, technology change does exist, and yet this has been true for centuries. We could take the airplane, for example. We'll get into the skyscraper in a second. Take the airplane. We saw explosive growth in the early 1900s from biplanes made of canvas and wood all the way through jet airplanes. And it seemed obvious that supersonic planes would continue that exponential progress. And yet, the Concorde supersonic plane limped along for 25 years before finally being put out of service just recently. And we travel today at the same speed as we did, roughly, at the dawn of the jet age 50 years ago. Or we could take skyscrapers. The 40 years leading up to 1931 with the Empire State Building, we saw the record skyscraper height increase by a factor of 4. The 40 years after that period, after that date, the record didn't increase at all. Or we can go back as far as the printing press with the first printed books. 1455, we saw Gutenberg's Bible. By the end of that century, we saw 1,000 printing presses continent-wide throughout Europe. We saw 10 million new books. And we can look at other examples. You could think of some yourself, I imagine, where we see explosive growth like this, followed by a slowdown to maturity. I'm thinking of things like electricity, telephone, railroads, and so on. And now it's the turn of the PC and the internet. It's their turn in the sun. So here's the point. Individual technologies can grow exponentially, but never technology in general. Let's revisit this quote from Kurzweil, his law of accelerating returns. He paints the idea of people in generations past living quiet, unchanging lives, and yet this is fiction. If you extrapolate what he says, see what his law of accelerating returns says, he says that in this 50-year period, almost 200 years ago, we create this amount of progress that was made here in 1 week. So what I'd like to do is take you back and let's look at some of these technologies that were invented during this time and see if that makes sense. I think you'll see that a lot more was happening then than friction matches, safety pins, and tin cans. The telegraph, 1844, very late in this period. We saw by the end by 1860, 100,000 miles of telegraph line worldwide. The steamship, at the beginning of this period, we see Robert Fulton's nascent steamship service. At the end, the 693-foot Great Eastern steamship built to carry 4,000 passengers. Canals are kind of old technology now, but during this time, they were a big deal. The 300-plus mile Erie Canal was built during this time. Following that were 3,000 miles of additional canals. The agriculture was a fairly slow-moving industry at this time. We saw the scythe and the barn as perhaps the apex of technology achievement. And yet the reaper was being built, the automatic reaper which reaped the grain, being built in the tens of thousands by the end of this period. The sewing machine, the same idea in the home. We had all work was done by hand. This was the first consumer appliance. The railroad, again, huge progress, 30,000 miles by the end of this period, doubling every decade. The printing press had an explosive period of growth during Gutenberg's time, and yet during this time we saw the same manual press, which really hadn't changed much since Gutenberg's time, turn into a mechanical press driven by steam. The rate of printing increased by a factor of 100. And of course the Industrial Revolution. We'll talk more about that in a second. So these are some of the major ones that we would all think of, and yet there are many more. Photography, interchangeable parts that gave us 500,000 clocks per year by the end of this period. Rifles, the Bessemer process for making cheap steel. Portland cement, reinforced concrete, rubber, anesthesia. Every one a revolution. Now, can anyone imagine that we duplicate this progress in a week? In my opinion, we'd be hard-pressed to duplicate this in the next 50 years. Now, to those who are still clinging to the idea of exponential growth, let me give a counterexample. This is what President Bush said in his State of the Union address. It's gotten a lot of press. He pointed out that the nation is addicted to oil. Very valid point. And let's focus on the word oil here. America is addicted to fossil fuels. And yet this has been true for 200 years. We've been increasingly dependent on fossil fuels. So the energy industry is one that, if only it were increasing exponentially, we'd really appreciate that. Not happening at all. We can look at some of the technologies that are on the forefront right now. The hydrogen economy, which uses fuel cells to drive cars. 1839 was when the fuel cell was invented. Solar cells, 1850. The first battery in the 1700s. The first car to exceed 60 miles an hour, 1899. So let's look at this idea that technology change increases exponentially. I'd say this myth is busted, and that technology change is increasing no faster today than it has since the Industrial Revolution. What I propose instead of the exponential model, that is the idea that technology in general is increasing exponentially, is the spotlight model. It acknowledges that a technology in its early growth period will be in the spotlight, will be growing exponentially, but then that spotlight will fade on that technology and move on to something else. Let's move on to another myth. Myth number 2 is the idea that technology is inevitable. And here's a quote that illustrates that. Andy Grove, chairman of Intel, said, "Like a natural force, technology is impossible to hold back. It finds its way no matter what obstacles people put in its place." And here's another. This is by Stuart Brand. It's been said about an onrushing technology, you're either part of the steamroller or you're part of the road. In other words, get on or get out of the way. And here again, this idea is widespread, it's seductive, it's almost intuitive, and yet, I'm telling you, this is a myth. The hard truth is that most new products fail. Here's a recent consumer example, the Segway. It was supposed to revolutionize personal transportation. It, of course, didn't. It was very cool technology, admittedly, and yet it was a flop in the marketplace. Let me give you a personal example of this inevitability being sucked into this idea. This is a human-computer conversation from 1970, back when I was young and impressionable in high school. The environment was a very simple, very primitive graphical environment, that wasn't the interesting thing. What was interesting was the interface, this text interface to the program. Find a block which is taller than the one you were holding and put it in the box. Or is at least one of them narrower than the one which I told you to pick up? So slightly convoluted sentences. And it seemed obvious to me that HAL, the computer in 2001, was just around the corner. This seemed inevitable. Here's Ted Nelson's observation on things like this. He says, I mistook a clear vision for short distance, and I think that was the problem that I fell into here. Now, we could put our heads together and come up with, I'm sure, 36 examples of future hype like this, technologies which did not live up to the hype surrounding them. And this could be technologies that didn't just completely flopped completely, or were very delayed given what we were told. We were told that the telephone, given the telephone, that the video phone was inevitable. If today we have the TV, then tomorrow, of course, it'll be 3D TV. If today we can predict the weather, then tomorrow we'll be able to control it. And again, there are many others. Home robots, e-books, moon bases, self-driving cars, smart cards, fax newspapers, paper clothes, on and on. And I'm sure we again could find even more. So this technology, this myth, is busted. Here's the point. That shiny new technology is not inevitable. Usually, the emperor has no clothes. And when you think about it, predicting this sort of thing is tough. I had in the attract loop beforehand the idea that when you get the feeling when you feel like you want to predict the future, you better lie down until that feeling goes away. And that's probably good advice in this case. When you think about the PC and the internet, they weren't underestimated 40 years ago. They weren't estimated at all. They weren't even on the radar screen. And that's the challenge we, of course, have looking forward 40 or even 20 years into our own future. And this is not an academic issue. You remember the Seattle Sonics basketball team, the full name is the Supersonics. And the basketball team was so named because Boeing was hopefully on the verge of getting the SST, that is Supersonic Transport contract. This is what the Vice President said at about that time. It must be obvious to anyone with any sense of history and any awareness of human nature that there will be SSTs, and super SSTs, and super SSTs. Mankind is simply not going to sit back with the Boeing 747 and say, this is as far as we go. And yet, of course, it did. So here we have a national leader who is correctly making the point that we need to have a sense of history and an awareness of human nature, and yet it needs to be correct. So a leader duped by these technological myths can get himself into trouble. Now here's a modern example. This is, again, President Bush was pushing this new thinking on energy. Now as I read this to you, look for the one word that stood out for me. Let's see if you can find it. Our nation is on the threshold of energy technology that I think will startle the American people. The word that stood out for me was startle. And I'm thinking as I read this, okay, startle like video phones startle us, or maybe personal flying vehicles, or fusion power, or AI, or any of, again, dozens and dozens of things that were said to be inevitable and yet just didn't happen. So the point here is that startling technology is great, but that's not enough. And we deceive ourselves if we think that it is. Startling technology, you can find it on the cover of Popular Science any week. That is just the beginning. I'd like to move on to one last myth. This is a personal favorite. It's the idea that today's technology is so amazing that it eclipses all that came before. Let me illustrate that with a couple of quotes. This is from 1995. The internet is the most transforming technological event since the capture of fire. I used to think it was just the biggest thing since Gutenberg, but now I think you have to go back farther. Or here's one from 1999 from James Gleick. Moore's law codified our lightning speed up in the pace of technological change. The acceleration of technology became exponential officially. Now, admittedly, today's technology, the internet, the PC, are unprecedented, but that's just like all other major technologies that came before. Now, what I'd like to do is help us or explore seeing the internet and PC correctly, not out of malice, but just because these are impressive enough technologies that they will stand on their own, seeing them correctly. In the case of the internet, I think if you look at the internet applications, the important applications are not new. and the new ones are not important. Let's explore this a bit. In 2004, we saw $70 billion in e-commerce. Some pretty serious money. Now, if we look at that compared to other forms of commerce, we find that of all non-store sales, that includes mail and phone, e-commerce was only 20%. And if you look at all retail sales, e-commerce was only 2%. So yes, it's growing, yes, it's important, but again, let's see it in context. And let me suggest to you that if you want a real revolutionary technology in the area of commerce, I give you catalogs, the boring paper catalog. Turn the clock back to 1870s. You've got the new technology of the railroad with the old technology of mail, plus the catalog, and you have empowered millions of rural Americans to buy things they couldn't buy before. Now, in the case of e-commerce, most sales are diverted sales. They're not new sales. They're not sales that could not have happened before. They're sales that they're a nice increase in convenience, but again, not sales that couldn't happen before. So before e-commerce, we had catalogs. Before email, we had phone and mail. Before research on the internet, which of course I use quite a bit for my book, we had libraries and encyclopedias. And I would suggest that the jump to libraries was a much bigger jump in terms of research than the internet. And it wasn't the internet that brought information to the masses, it was the fast printing presses of the 1820s and 30s. We were told in the 1990s that the internet changes everything. But keep in mind that we're told in the 1960s the space travel changed everything. And the 50s, the nuclear power changed everything. Let me give you a suggestion for a technology that really did change everything. In 1815, we had the Battle of New Orleans. It's the last battle of the War of 1812. Now, who knows what really curious, ironic thing accompanies the Battle of New Orleans?
It happened after the war.
The war was over, thank you. The war had been over for 2 weeks. The combatants didn't know because the treaty had been signed in France, and it took a long time for the information to get there. Now, you fast forward less than 30 years, you've got the telegraph. Information is no longer cargo, it is now data being sent electronically and traveling near the speed of light. 1860, 100,000 miles of telegraph line worldwide. 1866, the first successful transatlantic cable. And at this time, you have people in any major city in the United States reading in their morning paper news from around the world from the previous day, just like we do today. So I suggest the telegraph is really a big deal. Let's move on to the PC. I feel that Moore's law, the idea that computing power doubles every 2 years, is amazing, but it's only amazing. Let's look at a few things here. The cost change, the cost for computing power, which Moore's law addresses, that drop has been truly amazing. A given amount of computing power has dropped to 0.02% the cost of what it was 25 years ago. And yet, when you go to the store, you don't buy computing power. You buy a computer. And the price of those has dropped a nice amount, 25%, dropped to 25%, and yet that's not unprecedented over 25 years compared to refrigerators and TVs and VCRs and so on. Let's look at this another way. What fundamental new applications have we seen on the scale of word processing or spreadsheets in the past 10 years? I would guess, not being an expert here, but I would guess that maybe gaming is the biggest one. Not quite in the same category. And let me ask you this. What benefit, if I replace the PC that you have now with one that was 100 times faster, would that make you 100 times more productive? Would it make you twice as productive? Would it make you twice as anything? And yet if you contrast that with something as mundane as a truck has a certain capacity, a certain volume. You double the volume, it carries twice as much wood or dirt or something. The operator is now twice as productive. And this is true for construction equipment, farming equipment, factory machines. It doesn't apply in that way to PCs. I can't resist, I can't miss this one. This is the mother of all technology change. Let's just pursue this just real briefly, just to remind you of something that I think you're already rather familiar with. The opening shot of the Industrial Revolution was in 1733 with a very small technology which made the weavers about 4 times more productive than they had been before. Now the spinners, these people who spun the yarn and thread, They were the bottleneck. So they responded. They had some technologies. They became more productive. And now it was the weavers that were the bottleneck. They responded in turn. So over the course of a few decades, we now have both professions, both industries, totally mechanized. But now where's the bottleneck? It's the step before the thread, it's the wool carding. That was mechanized. Next, it was the step before that, cleaning the cotton gin, mechanized that. Now water power was not enough. We went to steam power. By 1830, in England, 100,000 mechanized looms, 10 million mechanized spinning spindles. The productivity for an individual increased by a factor of 200. Here's an American example. By the 1830s, the mills in Lowell, Massachusetts were producing fabric at the rate of 100 miles per day. This is the 1830s. It didn't stop there. This was in the cotton industry. It moved from cotton to other fabrics, silk, linen, and wool. The jacquard loom was the first use of punch cards that was used. This is about 1805. This was used to weave silk. Machines were used for stockings, for lace. Other areas were the bottleneck now: bleaching, dyeing, printing, and it moved beyond textiles themselves to other industries: glass, pottery, and other things were the bottleneck. There was pressure on coal mining, on metals, on transportation. And keep in mind, there was no wise and experienced central commission guiding this whole thing. This was all done on the fly. The modern factory was just happening, just being done on the fly. And of course, this only talks about the industrial side. This ignores the human side. We're pretty familiar with this. Most factory workers were women and children, some as young as 5 years old. The working conditions were noisy, dangerous, accidents were common, work days were up to 16 hours, the slums were overcrowded, the food was poor, washing water was filthy. This is not an isolated issue in some small corner of England. By 1850, half the workforce was in this industry. It got so bad that in 1811, the Luddite uprising, for about 15 months, it was a huge issue in the manufacturing part of England. Lead roofs, lead downspouts were being scavenged for the lead. Bullets were being made. This was during the Napoleonic Wars, and yet 10,000 troops from that war were stationed in this part of England to keep down the unrest. In the space of a generation, independent work on farms had given way to noisy work in 6-day weeks in noisy and dangerous factories. England had gone from a country like every other to a country like no other. Let me give you a personal example of the idea of today's technology overcoming all. After I left Microsoft, I wanted to get into the education software area, but since we're not talking about that, you can sort of anticipate where that went, and this statistic, I think, really indicates that. The market completely collapsed. I'd like to talk about one last thing before we leave this myth. This is a quote from the Department of Commerce in '98. As I read this, there are two errors in here that I'd like to emphasize. As I read this, try to look out for those. Radio was in existence for 38 years before 50 million people tuned in. TV took 13 years to reach that benchmark. 16 years after the first PC kit came out, 50 million people were using one. Once it was open to the general public, the internet crossed that line in 4 years. The two concerns that I have are here. 50 million people was half the population when the radio came out. It's only 20% in the case of the internet. And also, once it was open to the general public, obviously the internet didn't start in '91. It started in 1969. So this is a little deceptive by ignoring that fact. So I think if we look at the timeline and look at these four inventions and look at more objective metrics for the growth of these industries, we can start from invention to 2% market penetration and 50%. So if we use that for all four of these technologies, we find the radio, the TV was almost identical, PC quite similar, then the internet. So I think the idea that the latest technologies come faster and faster has completely evaporated. One thing that I think stands out here is this observation about the PC over here on the right side. This poster child for the our times are unprecedented mindset took quite a long time compared to even the radio and TV to make it in the marketplace. All right, so this idea is busted. Yes, the PC and Internet are valuable new technologies, but no more so than any others since the Industrial Revolution. Let's talk about the hidden costs behind this. This again is the bottom line issue here. Yes, we're duped by these myths, but so what? Why does that cost us? Say you're buying a laptop. You think you're buying a computer, and yet you're really buying computerization. So the laptop might cost $1,000. You upgrade every 2 years. That's $500 per year. And yet studies show that the total cost is more like $5,000 per year. This is because of these hidden costs. Maintenance, software upgrades, training time, downtime, and of course the big cost is when we as users are forced to support the computer and figure out problems ourselves. Let's move from the computer as an individual item and look at computers in the aggregate. How much do businesses worldwide spend on IT? $2.7 trillion. $2.7 trillion every year. And what that means is that if the benefits, the returns on that investment were $2.7 trillion every single year, they would just break even. It's a huge amount of money. Putting your finger on the cost is fairly easy. Trying to find the benefit is a whole lot harder. Let me just toss out sort of a random observation. In the period from 1950 to 1980, we saw the washing machine be widely used in the United States. The productivity benefit that provided was a little bit unusual, not quite what you might expect. The time spent on laundry did not decrease during that time. However, the volume of laundry increased by a factor of 10. So it's a huge productivity increase, and yet maybe not quite the way you'd expect. The person responsible for the laundry still had quite a bit of work. So the challenge here we have with the $2.7 trillion is that the computer used to be a way to get ahead. It used to be a competitive advantage when you had it and the other guy didn't. That was a big deal. Not so anymore. Everyone has it. It's a cost of doing business, and as a result, we just pay what it costs. And of course, this is just the PC. The Internet's a pretty crazy place. We have spam. Half all email is spam. There's scams. Spyware. I got burned by a virus myself about 6 months ago. And misinformation. One of the best things about the Internet is that anyone can publish. One of the worst things about the Internet is that anyone can publish. So the challenge that we have as information seekers is wading through the misinformation, the chaff, to get the things that we wanted. And anyone who didn't have a voice before the Internet didn't have a voice for reason. We've had for centuries the ability to get out important information. And then there are things like stress. It's, again, rather hard to put our finger on how much stress costs us, and yet cost us it does. We're told that we need to have a blog, we need to have a website, we need to have the latest gadget. You go on vacation and you panic because your resort doesn't have email access. Does email and the cell phone allow you to be connected 24/7, or does it force you to be? Used to be an advantage, now it's an obligation. Let's take voice over IP or internet telephony as an example. I just raised this as one example for a chance to practice some skeptical thinking that I'd like to encourage. We're going with voice over IP, again, internet telephony, from a private secure network with a downtime of 3 minutes per year to, I hope you're sitting down, the Internet. It's like an open book test. We know what's going to happen. The Internet has spam. We're going to have eavesdropping. We're going to have viruses. And 5-10 years from now, we're going to read articles about people shocked by this. And yet, it seems like we could sort of see this coming. Not to say that we shouldn't go there, but let's go there with our eyes open. One last thought on the hidden costs. There was an interesting study that looked at happiness over the past 50 or 60 years, during a time when technology luxuries became essentials. Thank you. But when technology luxuries became essentials, The economy increased by a factor of 3 per capita. Studies show that happiness didn't increase at all. And if you imagine taking somebody from 50 or 100 years ago, bringing them to the present and showing them the technological marvels we have, you would think that they would say, I've died and gone to heaven. This is just so amazing. And yet we just become accustomed to the things we have. And the hope for increase in happiness just isn't there. Now, I see you in this audience as wearing a number of hats. You're technology creators. You are early adopters. But just for the purpose of this slide, let's imagine that you're just ordinary technology consumers, and let's see where this goes. I'd like to end with 5 guidelines for being a smarter technology consumer. Number 1 is be skeptical. Anticipate the hype. Look for it in ads. Look for it in articles about new products. Look for those hidden costs. Insist that new technology prove its worth first before you buy. Number 2, beware the predictions. Most predictions are wrong. Most new products fail. Let someone else buy that Segway. Too often the high-tech train leaving the station is only an amusement park ride. Number 3, give yourself a permission slip to check out of the technology fast lane. Know why you buy, and make sure it's not because someone tells you to. Number 4, get involved with the debate. If you see a short-sighted government action, is it with NASA on one end, is it with PCs and schools on the other end, then comment on it. If not in a letter to the editor, then perhaps around the water cooler. Just a couple of interesting facts. The U.S. is no longer the leader in the use of broadbands or cell phones, in internet penetration, or in the manufacture of consumer electronics. Now, are these important metrics? Maybe yes, maybe no, but again, get involved with the debate. The digital divide, does that still exist? If so, is that an issue we should worry about? Again, get involved with the debate. So don't surrender your voice to government or business. Technology is too important to let it take care of itself. And one last one, relax. Resist the alarmist claims that technology is changing faster and faster, because it isn't. That society is about to be changed beyond all recognition, because it won't be. And that you won't be able to handle it. Because I'm sure you can. Thank you.
Yeah, questions?
Questions? Yeah.
I know you made a mention about Moore's law. I'd like to get your reaction about what some people call Metcalfe's law. Metcalfe was, as you probably might know, as the inventor of the Ethernet.
Right.
And he said that the utility of a network is proportional to the square of the number of people on it.
Right.
So if that law is true, let's assume that it's true, in that case, the internet would be the first case where people from all around the world would be able to cheaply interact with each other and add utility to the network, making the network even more valuable as more and more people get onto it. And it's a geometric progression, it's a linear progression. And never before in history has that happened.
Well, I think you've got networks like that. You've got the fax network, you've got the telephone network where Metcalfe's law really applies, where you have a number of identical people. Every phone is the same as every other phone, more or less. I mean, you have business phones and consumer phones. And it's a little bit more complicated, as you probably are alluding to, in the internet. You've got individuals emailing, you've got business sites, and so on. In the book, I have what I call the Metcalfe fallacy, and that's the idea of misapplying Metcalfe's law. You've heard I think it was the Bruce Springsteen song, 57 channels and nothing on. And that, I think, is an application of Metcalfe's fallacy, where you increase the number of channels, and the first shopping channel is a big deal, the first reality show. And yet, once you have the second, third, fourth, 2 reality shows are not 4 times as cool as 1. It's more of a logarithmic thing as opposed to an exponential thing. So you suggest that there may be some exciting new possibilities we haven't seen yet. You may be right, but I think we have to watch out for this fallacy. Yeah.
I just wanted to give a historical example, because actually there has been a network like that. It was called the Telegraph. The Queen city that employed it was London. They had mail service 6 times a day, because people could communicate with one another almost real time using telegraphs and using their mail service within the city of London. And an interesting novel that introduces this technology and uses it to new effect is Dracula. The vampire hunters in the city of London, if you read Dracula carefully, are coordinating their movements throughout the city going to Dracula's lairs and taking care of them, trying to catch him, using the Queen's Own Post and telegraphs.
And
Messages.
it's the same kind of thing I think is true in Sherlock Holmes, where you have, Watson has the afternoon mail come yet, implying that there's more than one. We have more than one newspaper per day. We have, you want to send a message, you could IM it today, but you could use the telegraph in the past. There certainly are advantages, changes, improvements in the present, but you're right. We really often shortchange the technology we had in the past. Yes.
I like your general point, but like most people who have a point, I think you push it too far. I think the PC and the internet have had more revolutionary effects than you give them credit for. Just taking examples from my own life, one of the most revolutionary things that's affected my life in the last 2 years is the digital video recorder. I remember talking to my friends in hardware and image processing 15 years ago about the possibilities for digital video recording, and they say, "Oh, it's not practical. You can't do the MPEG compression algorithm in real time." But it's completely changed the way I watch TV.
Right.
Internet shopping. I happen to be a wine collector. The only way I used to be able to get wine was to go make the rounds of my local wine shops, and if they had it, I'd buy it, and if they didn't, I couldn't buy it. Now I buy from internet merchants all over the country, and get things I could never get before. I'm general chair of a conference coming up in June, and the whole thing is organized by email communication with 20 other, conference organizers who I've never had all in the same place at the same time. So, I think you could go on like this.
Sure. Yeah, all your examples are very valid, and I certainly agree with them, acknowledge them. I'm not saying, of course, that technology change doesn't exist. What I'm saying is that it's this change of this magnitude, of this kind of, sit down and wipe your brow because it's amazing magnitude, has been around for a long time. The Donner Party in the 1830s or 40s, whenever it was, you know about that sort of tragic trip. The 6-month Oregon Trail trip was turned into 6 days by the Transcontinental Railroad. So in terms of like a really big change, that was a pretty big change. And in the case of the DVR, you've got the DVR, you've got the VCR, you've got television itself. I'm not sure that the DVR is just head and shoulders above all other entertainment technology. So I think that, yeah, it's a step forward, absolutely. But in terms of things getting faster and faster, things getting bigger and bigger in terms of importance, I'm not sure that's the case.
As a reaction to that, I think you can say, being able to buy wine online like that is great, but isn't wine itself the more important invention? Isn't I don't drink. And even the idea of having a conference, I think, is more important than the fact that it's easier to set it up.
That's a good point. Yeah. Suze?
I think that we tend to use ourselves as the measure of many things, but to me, the difference that the amount of transatlantic fiber has made, say, in the economy of India or China, is very profound and well on the order. An Indian commentator who was here not long ago was noting that the GDP per increase for every year of the Industrial Revolution was about 3%. And that was a lot over 100 years. But the increases in China and India have been on the order of 6 to 10% a year for the last 20 years. The number of people who are able to do professional work of a different order, communicate, is having extraordinary effects in those societies. I think it is profound. It is changing our whole world. What we compete on, the basis on which we compete, many, many aspects of life that I think we don't see on a kind of day-to-day level quite the same way. So I think I'd argue that the internet is having those effects. Mm-hmm. Maybe not in the way they were predicted. I agree with you there, but it really is changing the world.
Yes, in the back.
Yeah, isn't that kind of sort of tying into your spotlight idea, though, that there is change, but you have to look to see where it really is and how long it lasts. So
I think so, and in the example Sue's raised of just an explosive amount of growth in the economy, I suspect that's a spotlight issue where 10% increase per annum increase isn't going to last forever. It's not going to be 10% for a while and then 50 and then 20. We have this enormous growth for a while, and we'll see it as a spike, as many other things have been.
it'll plateau
Right.
at some point. I just want to have a follow-on to that, though. Maybe an example would be maybe accessibility technology, where you use computers to give people who would otherwise would not have the ability to be able to move easily around the city if they're blind, for example.
Terrific.
Suddenly, they can, but at some point that will saturate. Once all these blind people have PDAs that give them GPS navigation, at that point that market will fill out, and it will, that there won't be as much of a demand for these things because everybody will have one.
I think so, and I think also in the example you raise, we need to watch out that we've had a lot of predictions that we'd have computers helping in all kinds of ways that really haven't come to pass. So I suspect that we'll see continued progress in the area of accessibility, and yet we need to make sure we're not surprised when it's not as if we look at the union of all possible things that might happen, we often sort of see that as the likely future, and yet so many products in the lab fail that I think we need to see that realistically. Eric.
One of the things that I found provocative about the abstract and the talk today, and for me it bears a lot more thinking about, is the challenge of getting enough historical perspective to compare what we've seen in our lifetimes versus things that happened 50, 80, 100 years ago, because obviously we weren't around 50, 80, 100 years ago. And I'm curious how hard it was and how you got some of that perspective from, Industrial Revolution, the impact of the printing press, things like that. How did you get that sense and were able to kind of rationalize it with what you've seen in your lifetime?
Actually, this is maybe 8 or 10 years ago that I sort of began to get the idea that maybe today's technology wasn't getting increasingly fast, that the exponential curve was perhaps a fallacy. And from that, I became interested in all these other technologies. What was it like in the early days of the printing press? And what was it like in the early days of the Industrial Revolution? So I've been collecting those kinds of things for a long time. So I guess just sort of had my radar out for a while. It's a fascinating, understanding the history a bit better. And I think if we don't understand the history, if we sort of look at the snapshot of today, then we delude ourselves by saying, okay, well, I'm kind of seeing maybe it's exponential curve. Well, end of story. It's obviously just going to get faster and faster in the future. Yeah.
Actually, with the segue, it occurred to me that when we talk about technology being inevitable, and then we talk about the forces that may delay the introduction of a new technology, we tend to think of, religion. They'll freak out. They won't want that new technology. Vested power bases that are threatened by the new technology, they'll do what they can to suppress it. Competing products, they'll do what they can to suppress it. But I personally think the thing that really killed the segue is that you looked stupid on it. And that any product that's going to violate our basic primate hierarchy ideas of what makes a person look good is not going to be adopted.
When I was at Microsoft about 15 years ago, there was a product that you would put on your glasses. It was a heads-up display, basically. And part of the problem that people found was people just don't like things that are close to their eyes. And so there's a big difference, as you suggest, from it's possible. Well, yeah, fine, but are people going to use it? Virtual reality. Some of the problems they've found there are that when you do some serious virtual reality immersion, there's sort of a vertigo and even nausea problem even a day or two later. So trying to take this thing that we are and shoehorn it into this or that technology box so often works, but not always. So you raise a good point about something as simple as just looking foolish in the case of the segue. That's very valid. I think actually when you look at things like why do we not have mile-high skyscrapers or why do we not have SSTs, it's more economics. Economics is another pretty major factor there also. Oh, yes?
I just wonder what you make of the oft-repeated thing that technology actually is quite revolutionary, but not for the purpose that is foreseeable or that immediately comes to mind. Inventions that turn out to be quite revolutionary, but are actually for purposes different than invented. Do you see that having a greater effect for some of these social changes, and especially with computers?
That's a good question. The area of unexpected consequences is one that I'm quite passionate about. I think typically what you find is unexpected bad consequences, where DDT, it's this totally benign thing, except, well, not really all that benign when you actually get into it. What you suggest is applying it here, and it kind of works there, but who knew about this other thing? And that's a good point. I wish I had more time in the book to get into that sort of thing, but that's a bit tangential. There we go. Yeah. Yeah.
So what should companies like Microsoft do in promoting technology?
Good question. Yeah. The challenge that I have in speaking to groups like this is that even now, I'm you guys are the experts, not me. And if I go even farther out of my comfort zone, it's even worse. So the challenge that I have is going to groups and trying to help them see the future better, which I think I can to some small extent. And yet, what I'd like to do is I like to undercut some of these foolish predictions. So predicting the future is really not what I do. What I would hope to do is give some tools, mostly skepticism, and encourage people use that. So when you're told, here's a new technology that you just got to incorporate into your product, you'll have a few more examples in technology history of where that really didn't work out. Yeah.
I definitely agree with you. I was skeptical 10 years ago when I was consulting on the internet and so forth. I saw it sort of back to the traditional three-tier layer. Well, gee, that's just another UI, so forth. But I think as far as flattening out of curves, I agree. It seems to be it's economic and so forth, and people just sort of reaching a point. Well, we don't need to go beyond the jets that we have now as far as speed go. We don't need to do this. It's not valuable economically. Which, using that to address the one point of what would you do with a computer that was 100 times faster, and broadening that out to mean more than just the PC, but general computing, tying in connections, networks, so on and so forth. I think your particular slide there focused in on a single activity. It focused in on the weaver or the spinner or something like that. What I could see using a computer or computing with 100 times more power is in the multitasking. In other words, I've got something that's now a part of my house. It's monitoring the house, it's monitoring my stocks, it's doing all these multitasking things for me, giving me alerts if something's going on that I need to know about. That's where I could see that 100 times power coming into play. Not a single activity, because I'm not going to be able to type faster and make Excel go any quicker.
Right, that's a good point. Unfortunately, I love that idea, but I question how long it's going to take us to get there. The idea of the automated home where it's controlling all kinds of things and doing things in the background. I guess one question I would have is how much computing power does that take? Perhaps not all that much. But the idea of having the computer as it does what I tell it to, and that's about it, for it being a little bit more autonomous and smarter. I love that idea, but I think that concept has been a very slow process.
I think,
Jack?
I think kind of follow up on that. 100 times faster on a specific problem might be really useful. That doesn't necessarily equate to 100 times faster on every single problem you might face. And I think that's where computing power actually can get interesting, is that depends on what we, just automating my home, I don't really care if I can make the lights go on faster or not. I personally need the exercise to walk over the wall. But I would like, I think the example, what was it, a few years back when I did the SETI thing that was going across distributed computing? That was an interesting application of distributed processing.
The challenge I think we have, though, is finding applications that are compute-bound. So things like weather forecasting is compute-bound, car crash simulation, engineering applications, those are compute-bound. They could, if you give them a faster computer, they can use it. This is a supercomputer category. And yet for things like word processing, if I just to do the simple things of word processing, typing stuff, changing stuff, deleting, moving around, I could be using an IBM PC from 1991, and just that one small thing, admittedly, I could be doing that as fast as I could today.
No, absolutely. It's still not any faster today than it was 25 years ago.
Yeah.
Well, I think one of the things that is not given enough credit is what I call the PITA factor, or the pain in the ass factor. And a lot of the software innovations are thrown out there, and they just wind up complicating my life and making it worse. I mean, I could hook my computer that's 100 times faster up to everything in my house. Okay, now this light doesn't go on. What is it? Now I got to go debug the computer. Was it because I turned the printer on? Was it because I upgraded this? Is it because I put this drive on here? I got to call the phone line. I got to sit here and talk on the phone. I mean, the reaches. I'm totally into early adopter burnout. You know, I've learned new interfaces for computers, word processors, telephones, televisions, VCRs, digital doodads, the car. You don't want to hear me in the car. You know, I'm just tired of it.
I had a quote up before, you might have seen it, the observation that I have long wished my computer was as easy to use as my telephone, and my wish has come true because I no longer know how to use my telephone.
Yeah, the idea that my toilet might be hooked up to my computer and fail to function because I watched a TV show. This is a very frightening thought.
Yeah, cause and effect it could be a whole lot more complicated. When it's a light switch, you know, it's on or it's off. That's it.
I changed the bulb.
And that's enough. Yeah.
I don't know how this will connect, but a couple of years ago I had an idea for a new feature for Microsoft Word. And it was somewhat of a high-end feature, and I went through some channels and was proposing it to different people. And the answer I got back was that it was a great feature, but it would make Word too complicated, and it would contribute to the bloat that Word has. Right. And the basic message was that if a new feature is added to Word, it will not be promoted. It'll just be there, and maybe you'll discover it. But the idea is to kind of close it down rather than expand it, because of reaching this sense of being overwhelmed by technology. And it's true that, you know, most people down the street away from Microsoft are not going to use 90% of the features that a simple product like Word. The simple, I mean it in the sense concept, yeah. Most people aren't using the bulk of the features.
Sure. And yet, where does that leave Microsoft? I mean, they're eager to improve Word, and yet, what does improve mean? One topic that I do touch on actually is the idea of encapsulation, so that you used to do a couple of things manually, and it was better than doing them not at all. But then in the future, the software is smart enough to just turn all those features into nothing. So from a UI standpoint, good things just happen. So you know, spell checking, I'm not sure if that had a manual phase before it, but it just happens. And you know, the only thing that's a feature there is you know, I don't want it on this file. But I think you see a progression in software where you get, you know, more and more complicated, and then, you know, what's the end of this curve? I mean, it sounds like we're just getting worse and worse, and yet if you can encapsulate things, that might be the way to make things, to give you your usability goals, and yet increase the power of the overall product.
I have one question.
Oh yeah, sure.
Have you done any public talks, you know, like to the general masses, or radio show, call-in shows or anything? I just wonder what, you know, do people want to call and tell you their horror stories of technology, or like what their...
I have done that, and one of the challenges that I have is I'm hopefully being clear that what I'm talking about is, you know, yes, there's change, but let's sort of see it in context. And what the response seems to usually be is, well, you know, this has really been a big change for me. And I'm saying, okay, yeah, I understand that. That's true, you know, acknowledged. I'm not saying that technology change doesn't exist, but let's see it in context. So they seem to just be excited. And I guess it's a human thing. I mean, all of us, you know, high tech or not, we see the change. It delights us. It frustrates us. You know, we're whatever point we're on, it's sort of a new edge for us. We're leading edge from our own standpoint. So that's been a little bit curious that they don't, you know, go to step 2, which is, okay, I see your point that we need to see it in context. They're still back at step 1. Oh, this is
seeing like the Luddites rising together. You know?
No, and that of course is not my goal.
Yeah.
To turn this back into farmers, that's not the goal. Well, thank you all. If anyone has any other comments, please stay around.